Chapter 4: War and Revolutionary Strategy. I wrote in Chapter 1 that the strategic debates of the late 19th century workers' movement are more relevant to the modern workers' movement than those of the Third International. In the first place, because our times are closer to theirs than they are to the short 20th century. And secondly, because at least some of the strategic concepts of the Comintern are not simply rendered obsolete by the fall of the USSR, but are proved by the fate of the socialist countries to be a strategic blind alley. Nonetheless, we cannot splice the film of history to skip a century. Nor can we simply argue, as Antoine Artaud did in the 2006 LCR debate, that the current period is characterized by the end of the historic cycle, which began with October 1917. We live after the Great Schism in the socialist movement, which resulted from the 1914-18 war. Most of the organized left, and a good many independents still identify with traditional ideas derived from the first four congresses of the Comintern, usually in a diluted and confused form. Moreover, the Comintern reposed the problems of the state and internationalism, party organization, unity, and government coalitions. Any judgment on possible socialist strategies for the 21st century must take the Comintern's ideas into account, even if in the end it proves necessary to reject some or all of them. Strategic alternatives. There are three core elements of strategy proposed by the Comintern and its leadership. The first and the essence of the split was Lenin's response to World War I, the idea of a defeatist policy. The second was the idea of the split itself. This started with the notion that organizational separation from the right and the creation of a new type of international and a new type of party would immunize the workers' movement against repeating the right's betrayals. In 1921-22, it became apparent to the Comintern's leadership that the right and center could not be so easily disposed of, and the strategic problem of workers' unity and the question of government reposed itself in the form of the United Front policy. But this policy stood in contradiction to the concept of the party established in 1920-21 and proved short-lived. The third was the problem of what form of authority could pose an alternative to the capitalist political order. Beginning with all power to the Soviets, the Comintern leadership had shifted by 1920 to the idea that the dictatorship of the proletariat was necessarily the dictatorship of the Workers' Vanguard Party. The United Front turn of 1921-22 entailed a shift here as well, to the ideas of a workers' or workers' and farmers' government as the immediate alternative to capitalist rule. In this chapter I will discuss the question of war and revolutionary defeatism. This question comes first. Hal Draper has argued that Lenin was wrong on defeatism. If the strategic judgment expressed in defeatism was wrong, Lenin was also wrong to argue for a split with the anti-war centrists. War and betrayal. In August 1914, the parliamentary representatives of the German Social Democratic Party, SPD, and the majority of the larger parties of the Second International in the belligerent countries voted for war credits for their national governments. In doing so, they betrayed commitments which had been made at the 1907 Stuttgart and 1912 Basel Congresses of the International. If the war had appeared, as Engels imagined it in 1891, as a revanchist attack by France on Germany with Russian support, and had been fought on German soil, the defensist policy of the SPD might have been vindicated. However, the partial success of the Schlieffen Plan to outflank the French armies by attacking through Belgium, and the weakness of the Tsarist army meant that the war was not fought on German soil. Moreover, both the long background of rising inter-imperialist tensions and the immediate diplomatic context, German support of an Austrian ultimatum against Serbia for supporting what would now be called terrorism, made German policy appear aggressive, not defensive. On the other hand, had the Schlieffen Plan succeeded in rapidly knocking France out of the war would indeed have been, as many military leaders imagined it would be in 1914, a short one, and the error of the socialist leaderships would have been marginalized by the political consequences in the defeated belligerent countries, France and Russia. But the Schlieffen Plan did not work as intended. Invading France through neutral Belgium provided an excuse for British intervention on the French side. and the German forces outran their rail-based logistics and became overextended, enabling the French army to regroup forces and at the First Battle of the Marne, September 1914, to strike at a weakness in the German line. The result was that France was not knocked out of the war. Britain became fully engaged in it, and there developed the stabilized trench lines of the various fronts, factories of murder which were to run for another 4 years. The socialist leaderships had ended up accepting responsibility for an enormous crime against the working class and humanity in general. Peace and unity, or civil war and split? Lenin argued from the outbreak of hostilities for a clear assessment that this was a predatory imperialist war for the redivision of the world, an understanding shared by Luxemburg, Trotsky, and others. On this basis, it was to be regarded as reactionary on all sides. This, in turn, led Lenin to support the policy that came to be called defeatism, and for the slogan, "Turn the imperialist war into a civil war." With equal determination, he called for a decisive break with the right wing, and, indeed, from all those socialists who supported their own governments in the war. A section of the left and center endeavored in vain to restore the honor of the socialist movement by convening the Zimmerwald 1915, Kienthal 1916, and Stockholm 1917 conferences of socialists to promote a peace policy. As the true nature of the war became clear, elements of the center who had initially gone along with the right turned to an anti-war policy, but they still clung to the idea of re-establishing the unity of the International. Lenin now argued for a decisive break with the anti-war center as well as the right, on the basis that the center's pacifist line merely covered for the right. A left wing at the Zimmerwald Conference argued for a policy of pursuing the class struggle against the war. The Bolsheviks participated, but even among the Zimmerwald left, the instinct for unity of the movement was strong, and Lenin argued even for a break with those elements of the left who were unwilling to split from the center. There could be no real internationalism, he insisted in this context, without a willingness to carry on a practical struggle against one's own state's war policy, that is, defeatist propaganda in the armed forces. Until the October Revolution, it is fairly clear that Lenin could not carry the full rigor of his line within the Bolshevik leadership. The public statements of the Bolshevik Party in Russia were anti-war and characterized the war as imperialist and predatory, but did not go to the full lengths of defeatism. The Bolsheviks were equally unwilling to break decisively with the limited unity expressed in the Zimmerwald and Kienthal conferences and call openly for a new international, or the other aspect of Lenin's insistence on a clear split, to rename the RSDLP, Bolshevik, the Communist Party. Lenin's line was given strong apparent justification by the course of events. On the one hand, the October Revolution, plus the new regime's ability to hold power into 1918, seemed to confirm the claims of defeatism positively. On the other, the responses of the Russian, German, and international right and center to the February and October revolutions and the 1918-19 revolution in Germany seemed to negatively confirm the need for a rigorous split. A large enough minority of the parties of the Second International, including majorities in France and Italy, were willing to split from the right to support the proclamation of the Third International in 1919. The 21 conditions. Even so, the concerns for the broad unity characteristic of the Second International persisted within some of the parties affiliated to the Third. The Russian leadership resolved to force a cleaner break with the center tendency, and did so with the 1920 adoption by the Second Congress of the 21 conditions for affiliation to the Comintern. The defeatist position was not adopted in explicit terms, but the political essence of the content Lenin had intended by it was. Condition 6 provided that it is the duty of any party wishing to belong to the Third International to expose not only avowed social patriotism, but also the falsehood and hypocrisy of social pacifism. Condition 4 required that persistent and systematic propaganda and agitation must be conducted in the armed forces and communist cells formed in every military unit. In the main, communists will have to do this work illegally. Failure to engage in it would be tantamount of betrayal to their revolutionary duty and incompatible with membership in the Third International. And Condition 8 required that any party wishing to join the Third International must ruthlessly expose the colonial machinations of the imperialists of its own country, must support, in deed, not merely in word, every colonial liberation movement, demand the expulsion of its compatriot imperialists from the colonies, and conduct systematic agitation among the armed forces against all oppression of the colonial peoples. Hal Draper. Hal Draper has argued in his Lenin and the Myth of Revolutionary Defeatism that Lenin's use of defeat slogans in 1914-16 reflected his general tendency to bend the stick. He makes perfectly clear what he means, but that is how he seeks to underline, with heavy, thick strokes, the task of the day, by exaggerating in every way that side of the problem, which points in the direction it is necessary to move now. In Draper's view, the resulting slogan was incoherent and mistaken, and Lenin, when he was required to formulate slogans for practical purposes, did not use it. He argues that it ceased to be employed altogether in 1917 and through the early years of the Comintern, and was only revived by Zinoviev in 1924 as a club with which to beat Trotsky. Draper is usually an exceptionally careful scholar, and his work on Marx and Engels' ideas in Karl Marx's theory of revolution brilliantly draws out the political context of specific writings and arguments in order to make the underlying ideas clear. In Lenin and the Myth of Revolutionary Defeatism, however, Homer has nodded. Missing from Draper's argument about defeatism are two crucial elements. The first is that the primary political context is Lenin's argument for a clear split in the International, with the right and with anyone who wanted to maintain unity with the right, in particular with the center. This is the precise context of, for example, Lenin's polemic against Trotsky on the defeatism formula, and it is retained in Condition 6 of the 21 Conditions, a document whose whole purpose is to finalize the split with the Kautskyite center. The second is the concrete conclusion which follows from defeatism, that is, that the socialists should, so far as they are able, carry on an anti-war agitation in the ranks of the armed forces. In November 1914, Lenin wrote, "Refusal to serve with the forces, anti-war strikes, etc., are sheer nonsense, the miserable and cowardly dream of an unarmed struggle against the armed bourgeoisie, vain yearning for the destruction of capitalism without a desperate civil war or a series of wars. It is the duty of every socialist to conduct propaganda of the class struggle, in the army as well. Work directed towards turning a war of nations into a civil war is the only socialist activity in the era of an imperialist armed conflict of the bourgeoisie of all nations." In July 1915, in arguing against Trotsky for practical actions leading towards such defeat, Lenin comments as an aside, "For the penetrating reader, this does not all mean to blow up bridges, organize unsuccessful military strikes, and, in general, to help the government to defeat the revolutionaries. But neither here nor anywhere else does Lenin repudiate carrying on anti-war agitation in the ranks of the armed forces, and on the contrary, this is the principal concrete conclusion which follows from defeatism. And this, too, is retained in the 21 Conditions, in Conditions 4, a general obligation to organize and agitate in the armed forces, and 8, specifically on the colonial question. Carry on an effective agitation against the war in the ranks of the armed forces is unavoidably to undermine their discipline and willingness to fight. This was apparent in 1917 itself. It is confirmed by subsequent history. One of the few effective anti-war movements in recent history was the movement in the US against the Vietnam War. If we ask why this movement was successful, the answer is clear. It did not merely carry on political opposition to the war, demonstrations, etc., but also disrupted recruitment to the U.S. armed forces and organized opposition to the war within the armed forces. The result, together with the armed resistance of the Vietnamese, was U.S. defeat. It is clear enough that these judgments were intended to be strategic. The Zimmerwald left proposed a resolution condemning the imperialist character of the war and arguing, in a slightly less emphatic way than Lenin's version, for class struggle against it. An opponent, Cerati, argued that this resolution would be rendered moot by the end of the war, still anticipated in 1915 to be not far off. Lenin responded that, "I do not agree with Cerati that the resolution will appear either too early or too late. After this war, other, mainly colonial, wars will be waged. Unless the proletariat turns off the social imperialist way, proletarian solidarity will be completely destroyed. That is why we must determine common tactics. If we adopt only a manifesto, van der Velde, humanity, and others will once again start deceiving the masses. They will keep saying that they, too, oppose war and want peace. The old vagueness will remain. Right or wrong, then, Lenin's defeatism was arguing for two fundamental changes in the strategy of international socialism. The first was for a clear split, the abandonment of the historic policy of unity of the movement at all costs, which had flowed from the success of the Gotha unification, the SPD, and the unifications which it had promoted. The second was a new strategic policy in relation to war, or, more exactly, in relation to imperialist wars. This policy called for an open proclamation along the lines that the main enemy is at home, to turn the imperialist war into a civil war, and, complementing this, practical efforts to undermine military discipline by anti-war agitation and organizing in the armed forces. Limits of defeatism. Draper's view is that the defeat slogan is simply wrong, meaningless unless you positively wish for the victory of the other side. It must follow that unless you support such a scenario, you would not go beyond a slogan along the lines of, "Carry on the class struggle in spite of the war." That is, you would not arrive at Lenin's argument that the principal way to carry on the class struggle in such a war is to argue that civil war is better than this war, and to undermine military discipline by anti-war agitation and organization in the armed forces. The flip side of this argument is that Draper only partially addresses the internal limits of Lenin's argument. Lenin argued for generalizing a defeat position to all the 1914-18 belligerents, on the basis that 1914-18 was a war among the imperialist robbers for division of the spoils of the world. He, and the Comintern, further generalized this position to colonial wars, that is, the wars of the imperialist states to acquire and retain colonies and semi-colonies. They did not argue that communists in the colonies and semi-colonies should be defeatist in relation to those countries' wars for independence and against the imperialists. On the contrary, in this context, the Third and Fourth Congresses of Comintern urged the policy of the anti-imperialist front. Argued in my 2004 series on imperialism that the course of events since 1921 has proved that the policy of the anti-imperialist front is not a road to workers' power and socialism. That does not alter the point here that the dual defeatist policy is specifically designed for particular political conditions, those of inter-imperialist war. Pretty clearly, it is in fact more specific than Lenin realized, but it also contains underlying elements of general strategic principle, which need to be teased out of the specificity. Draper makes the point that when Lenin returned to Russia, he found that it was necessary to address mass defensism among workers and soldiers, and the defeat slogan disappeared as a slogan from Lenin's writings after April 1917. What is missing in Draper's account is that Bolshevik anti-war agitation and organization among the soldiers did not disappear after April. But the disappearance of the defeat slogan and the mass defensism were real. Mass defensism reflected the fact that as the war had evolved, it had become mainly a war fought on Russian soil, which Russia was losing. The masses could see perfectly well that the liberty they had won in February would not survive German occupation. The same issue was posed a great deal more sharply in 1939-45. World War II was indeed a second inter-imperialist war for the redivision of the world, but overlaid on this war was a class war against the proletariat and its organizations, begun with Hitler's 1933 coup, continued with German intervention in the Spanish Civil War, and with the defeatism of much of the French bourgeoisie and officer class in 1940, Quisling in Norway, and so on. The result was that the defeatist position adopted in 1938 by the founding Congress of the Trotskyist Fourth International lacked political purchase. Mass support, to the extent that it moved to the left against the bourgeois governments, moved to the communists who, after 1941, unequivocally favored the defeat of the Axis. It did not move in the direction of the defeatist, or at best equivocal, Trotskyists. The Trotskyists were split by the war, at least in Britain, France, and China, and probably elsewhere, between defeatists and advocates of the proletarian military policy, argued that the working class needed to take over the conduct of the war in order to defend its own interests. In fact, if we look back on 1914-18 itself, It should be apparent from what I said in discussing the outbreak of the war above that it was the specific military-political conditions of 1914 to 18 which allowed Lenin's thesis to obtain the sort of political purchase it did. If the war had been fought on German soil, as Engels anticipated in 1891, a German revolutionary defensist policy would have been vindicated. If it had been a short war, the issue would have been brushed aside. It was the enormity of 1914 to 18, and in particular the stalemated fronts, which powered both the defeatist thesis and willingness to split the international. In other words, the judgment that defeatism is the right approach to inter-imperialist wars is a concrete judgment about the particular war, but there are strategic principles which lie behind it. Terminal phase. Half the justification for defeatism was Lenin's belief that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism, and hence that 1914 to 18 showed that revolution was immediately on the agenda. This would mean that the strategy of patience was wholly superseded. This idea was expressed in several documents of the first 3 congresses of the Comintern, to assert that the major capitalist countries are on the verge of civil war. This judgment of the international situation is, in fact, the hidden secret of the defeatist line for the world inter-imperialist war. In such a war, it is an almost impracticable line for the Workers' Party of any single belligerent country. But if the workers' parties of all the belligerent countries agitate and organize against the war in the ranks of the armed forces, the possibility exists of fraternization between the ranks of the contending armies, leading to the soldiers turning their arms first on their officers and then on their political economic masters. This is the meaning of Lenin's argument in his polemic against Trotsky that it is essential to his policy that coordination and mutual aid are possible between revolutionary movements in all the belligerent countries. Such a line assumes that the mass workers' international exists, and that its national sections can be made to follow a common defeatist line. The idea that the class struggle, moving internationally into civil war, not only supported the position of turning the imperialist war into the civil war, it also underpinned Lenin's and his Russian co-thinkers' willingness to gamble on the seizure of power by a workers' party in a peasant-majority country. It justified the extremely sharp split line in relation to the right and center tendencies in the international socialist movement, and it supported the explicit conception of a more or less militarized workers' party adopted in 1920 to 21. I argued in my 2004 series on imperialism that this idea mistook the crisis of British world hegemony for a terminal phase crisis of capitalism. The Comintern was, in fact, already retreating from its full implications by mid-1921, but the Comintern leaders clung to it, and Trotsky clung to it to his death. They did so because, for the Russian leaders, it was their only hope of salvation. If the revolution in Western Europe, or that of the peoples of the East against colonialism, did not come to their aid, they had betrayed the hope of the socialist revolution as thoroughly as the right wing of the socialists by their actions in 1918 to 21. Cheka, suppression of political opposition, suspension of Soviet elections, strike-breaking, Kronstadt, and their theorization of one-party rule of the militarized party as a necessary aspect of the dictatorship of the proletariat. To say this, however, is still not to imply that the defeatist strategic line was wrong. It was at least partially right, because it made a true judgment about the state. State, war, and revolution. It is not the capitalist class which is the central obstacle to the emancipation of the working class, but the capitalist state and international state system. We have already seen this point in Chapter 1. Marx and Engels' critiques of Goethe emphasize the Lassallean's illusions in the German Empire. Chapter 2. The policy of government coalitions requires the socialists to manage the state as a competing firm in the world market, and therefore to attack the working class. The mass strike or revolutionary crisis immediately poses the question of government in the form of authority. And Chapter 3, the Kautskian Center downgraded the question of state form and ended by bringing state bureaucratism and nationalism into the workers' movement. A state is, at the end of the day, an organized armed force. The states of particular classes are tied to those classes by the forms in which they are organized. For the working class to take power, therefore, the existing capitalist or pre-capitalist state has to be smashed up. At the end of the day, this means that the coherence of the existing armed forces has to be destroyed. Lenin's judgment, expressed in defeatism, was that the war, because it was unjust and predatory, and because it showed imperialist capitalism coming up against its historical limits, offered the Workers' Party both the need and the possibility to destroy the coherence of the existing armed forces through anti-war agitation, and thereby to take power. The need was there because the war in itself involved the mass blood sacrifice of workers. It was also there because any war in which serious forces are engaged, and in which the international standing of the belligerent state is at issue, reshapes politics around itself. The class struggle therefore necessarily takes the form of the struggle against the war. This is not true of all wars. Colonial counterinsurgency operations, etc., reshape the politics of the colonial country, but do not necessarily reshape those of the imperialist country. The possibility was there because the war was unjust and predatory in character, and therefore tended to lose political legitimacy as it went on. Underlying the defeatist line, then, is a strategic understanding that in order to take power, the working class needs to overthrow the ruling class's state. That is, to break up the coherence of the state as an organization of armed force. This strategic understanding is in no sense dependent on the actuality of the revolution. Preparing for defeatism. The war immediately posed the question of state power and the coherence of the armed forces, as, in a different way, an internally driven revolutionary crisis or mass strike wave does. The advocates of the strategy of patience could have prepared the workers' movement and the society as a whole for the fact that this question would in future be posed. They chose not to. In his 1891 critique of the Erfurt program, Engels wrote that if one thing is certain, it is that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of a democratic republic. This is even the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the Great French Revolution has already shown. Democratic Republican military policy implies fighting for universal military training, a popular militia, and the right to keep and bear arms. It also implies that within any standing military force which may be necessary, the ranks should have freedom of political speech and the right to organize in political parties and trade unions. It further implies taking seriously the expression defense, which appears in ideological form in the Ministry of Defense. This means consistent opposition in principle to colonial wars and overseas interventions, including peacekeeping activities, which are invariably founded on lies and serve concealed imperialist interests. If we take every opportunity to spread the ideas of a democratic republican military policy, by doing so we arm the working class movement for the conditions in which defeatism becomes a real necessity. To the extent that we win individual reforms in this direction, we will in practice undermine the ability of the armed forces to be used in defense of the capitalist class, both against the colonies and semi-colonies, and also against a proletarian majority. These ideas are neither an innovation from Marxist principles, nor a Republican shibboleth. They are a version of the policy Engels urged on the SPD in 1892-9. In his series of articles, Can Europe Disarm? Their absence from the political arsenal of the British left is the product of a timid pacifism, which is covered by super-revolutionary phrases about rejecting reforming the bourgeois state. Defeatism and the Trotskyists. The Trotskyists have made of defeatism something different. Not a practical strategic choice for the working class's struggle for power, but a purity test. Every war becomes, like 1914-18, a test of the revolutionary moral fiber of organizations. Positions considered false on international conflicts are proof of succumbing to the pressure of the bourgeoisie. It has to be said that this Trotskyist use of war policy as a purity test does originate in the Comintern and Lenin's policy of defeatism, but it originates not in defeatism itself, but in a combination of revolutionary defensism with the arguments in 1914-18 and immediately after for the split from the right and center, to be discussed in the next chapter. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Trotsky argued that the workers' movement should favor the victory of the Ethiopians led by Emperor Haile Selassie. In the Japanese invasion of China, Trotsky argued in 1937 for the Chinese workers' organizations to pursue a defensist policy. The duty of all the workers' organizations of China was to participate actively and in the front lines of the present war against Japan. In 1938, Trotsky argued that in the highly unlikely event of a military conflict between Britain and the Vargas dictatorship in Brazil, the working class should be on the side of fascist Brazil against democratic Great Britain. Why? Because in the conflict between them, it will not be a question of democracy or fascism. If Britain should be victorious, she will put another fascist in Rio de Janeiro and will place double chains on Brazil. If Brazil, on the contrary, should be victorious, it will give a mighty impulse to national and democratic consciousness of the country and will lead to the overthrow of the Vargas dictatorship. The defensist argument, it should be clear from both the Chinese case and the hypothesis of a Britain-Brazil war, is an argument about the road of the working class to power in a colonial or semi-colonial country under attack from an imperialist power. It is a variant of the line of the anti-imperialist front. I have argued against this line in my 2004 series on imperialism. The false character of Trotsky's 1937 line for China is a particularly clear instance. The Kuomintang regime was a government in form, which in practice presided over warlordism. It was not an effective, coherent state. In this context, in order to defeat the Japanese invasion, what was needed was to create a state, alternative to the KMT pseudo-state. The policy followed by the Maoists, who fought on two fronts both against the Japanese and against the KMT, and as a result in 1948 were able to take power. To participate actively and in the front lines of the war, as Trotsky argued, would not open the road to the masses, but merely identify the communists, in this case the Trotskyists, with the failing KMT regime. In some cases, it is clear that revolutionary defensism would be the appropriate stance of communists in the colonial country. In others, like in China in the 1930s and Iraq today, the right approach of communists would be to create a third military camp. In yet others, like the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands/Malvinas in 1982 and the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the right response is a kind of revolutionary defeatism, that is, to denounce the irresponsible adventurism of the invasion. In his 1940 proposals of the proletarian military policy, in the wake of the fall of France, Trotsky was to return to revolutionary defensism. The capitalists and their state will sell you out to the Nazis, you need to arm yourselves. And by implication, soldiers need to take action against defeatist officers, and so on. This is in substance the same as Engels' defensist line of 1891. But this was not Trotsky's line for the colonial countries in the passages quoted above. On the contrary, these passages show a merely moralizing defensism, which demanded that the working class supported the weaker side. This is perhaps understandable in the Ethiopian case, given the marginality of the proletariat in Ethiopia in 1935. For China, it was Stalin's line, which Mao and his co-thinkers refused to follow. It would have been complete nonsense in the unlikely event of a British attack on Brazil. Leaving these defects aside, a critical point is that defensism in the colonial countries is a policy for communists in the colonial countries. Before 1935, Ethiopia was a semi-colony in the British sphere of influence. Ethiopian defensism by communists in Britain would therefore have amounted merely to demanding a more aggressive defense of British imperial interests against Italy, just as Serbian defensism in 1914 amounted to defense of British and French imperial interests. Brazilian defensism by communists in the United States, in the highly implausible circumstance of a British attack on Brazil in 1938, would similarly have amounted to defense of U.S. imperial interests. Iraqi defensism in Germany and France in 2002-3 would similarly amount to defense of German and French commercial interests in their companies' contracts with the Ba'athist regime. Defeatism in the imperial countries, on the other hand, no more needs to imply defensism of the other side than, for example, defeatism for Russian workers in 1914-18 meant victory to the Kaiser, for the reasons given above. Communists in the imperialist country or countries involved should be defeatist, that is, fight against the war, including by agitation as far as possible in the armed forces. That is, in the same way that Lenin urged defeatism in relation to the 1914-18 war. In relation to what should happen on the other side, their primary approach should be one of solidarity with the workers' movement and communists in the target country. Trotsky's moralizing version of colonial country defensism was then overlaid by purifying split arguments, in Trotsky's last political legacy to the Trotskyists. This was the 1939-40 split in the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party on the question of whether socialists should favor the victory of the USSR in its invasions of Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states in the wake of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. In his polemics in the lead-up to this split, Trotsky combined substantive arguments for Soviet defensism, siding with the USSR in war whatever the merits of the Soviet regime's particular actions, with arguments for a purifying split of the type used by Lenin and Zinoviev in 1914-16, and in the Comintern leadership's arguments for a split with the Kautskyites. Now, if it were true, as Trotsky claimed, that the USSR was a kind of workers' organization, a trade union that had seized power, and a strategic gain for the working class in spite of the bad leadership of the Stalinists, then defensism would be broadly justified, and it would be equally justified to call its opponents scabs. Soviet defensism would also clearly be a task of the working class in every country, whether imperialist or colonial, and whether at war with the USSR or not. Even so, it would not be completely justified. For example, I do not think that any Trotskyist group supported the 1974 Ulster Workers' Council general strike against the Sunningale Agreement, nor, on a smaller scale, have Marxist socialists ever given support to strikes which demand the exclusion of ethnic or religious minorities from the workplace, which have occasionally happened. In the case of capitalist attacks on the USSR, like the intervention in 1918-21, or like 1941, Soviet defensism would be plainly justified. Where the Stalinist regime used military force against a workers' revolutionary movement, as in NKVD operations in Spain, Soviet defensism would be obviously wrong. The Soviet invasions of Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states did not fall obviously into either case, so it would be necessary to ask whether, in the concrete, Soviet victory would strengthen or weaken the position of the working class as a global class. The Soviet invasions of Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states, in alliance with the Nazi regime, would probably not qualify. It is perfectly clear that the Hitler-Stalin Pact enabled the imposition of fascism through a German conquest in Western continental Europe and the Balkans. A large price for the international workers' movement to be expected to pay for a small Glakis west of the USSR, and one which proved in 1941 to be illusory. The nearest analogy in trade union affairs would be an event of a type which has from time to time happened. One craft union makes a deal with the employer which includes derecognition of other unions, and thus allows one section of the workforce to make gains at the expense of other sections. In reality, as I argued in the introduction, Trotsky's assessment was wrong. Given that there was no prospect of the working class taking power back from the bureaucracy, the Stalinist Soviet regime could not be considered as a strategic gain for the working class, or in the same light as a trade union. Other things apart, this assessment would imply that the USSR under Stalin should be approached as a nationalist Bonapartist regime based on the petty proprietors, that is, like the Brazilian Vargas regime, or, in modern times, the Iraqi Ba'athist regime, but with rhetoric much further left. This would imply a revolutionary defensist policy in some circumstances, like the 1941 German invasion. It would not imply such a policy in the case of an agreement with a neighboring imperialist power, Germany, to carve up the small states in the locality, Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states. Trotsky's position in 1939-40 was thus substantially wrong, irrespective of the arguments about the class character of the Soviet state. On top of this error came the argument that the opposition represented a petty bourgeois opposition, and one which was caving in to the pressure of U.S. imperialism. The result was a hard organizational split aimed to purify the SWP of this petty bourgeois influence, and accompanied by a conference resolution giving formal purging powers to the SWP party apparatus. But the brevity of the faction fight meant that the split took place on the basis of extremely muddled positions. As we will see in the next chapter, purifying splits do not achieve their object, to protect the pure revolutionaries from contamination. The 1940 split in the SWP and Fourth International is a textbook example. After the fall of France, Trotsky radically diluted his principle of dual defeatism in the inter-imperialist war in favor of the proletarian military policy. By 1948, the Orthodox majority were demanding the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Eastern Europe, the exact opposite of Trotsky's line in 1939. The muddle of 1937 to 40 has become a part of Trotskyist orthodoxy. That is, Trotskyists in the imperialist countries must be defeatist in colonial wars in the peculiar sense of being defensist in relation to the colonial country or movement. Trotskyists in the colonial countries must be defensist in the same sense. To do otherwise is said to be pro-imperialist or social chauvinist, thus justifying a hard split to purify the party. The left Trotskyist groups, especially those influenced by the U.S. Spartacus League, have been most systematic in pursuing this policy, but it has remained part of the polemical arsenal of the softer Trotskyist groups whenever differences arise on war questions. The Spartacus League and sub-Sparts might be said to have reduced this idea to absurdity when they argued that Afghan communists should join with the Taliban, who would immediately shoot them, to fight U.S. imperialism, a policy of revolutionary suicide which might have been borrowed from Monty Python's Judean People's Front crack suicide squad. But the absurdity crown must surely belong to the British SWB comrades, who claim their revolutionary credentials by calling for victory to the Iraqi resistance. This same SWP has for the last 20 years resolutely opposed, in the name of broad unity, any political agitation either for a democratic republican military policy or for organized workers' self-defense. Today its revolutionary defeatist, supposedly anti-imperialist, alliance with political Islam involves sacrificing fundamentals of democratic, let alone socialist, policy.